Bien, nous allons maintenant avec Amandine Diener vous présenter.
Fine. You're going to have Amandine Diener presenting 8 years of work of HNES 20, an encyclopedia, which is the history of architecture in the 20th century. One word of the Committee of History of the Ministry of Culture. A rather ancient institution that was also set up by Girard, but he's 91 years old, so he's not with us. And it is an institution that gathers people of all walks, equipment users, cultural equipment users, historians. You have one person from the French Academy and a number of individuals that have been in the Ministry of Culture looking into that sector. 3 individuals, Florence Contenay, she's the advisor to the National School of Administration. She was one of those individuals who Max Carré prepared the great reform of architecture back in the 60s. And then she was at the head and president of the School of Architecture. Reto Duc, who's in fact at the École Pratique des Hautes Études and a specialist of historical monuments, working in the history of the architectural assets that we have in France, the nation, building the nation. And she is the chief editor of Livraison et Histoire, History of Architecture, and I myself, Pedagogic Unit number 1 and number 6. You see the type of recruitment that we now have since after 2001. So, we used to meet from time to time. The wonderful staircase of the Ministry of Culture. Sometimes we try to see whether we didn't see the minister around. And then we climbed up 2 or 3 levels, 4 levels, up to our premises of the Committee of History, number of PhD, etc. Now, among the work we've collaborated in, work on the documentary sources, on the Mitterrand project, the major project, the work by Dominique Jamet, and there was another piece of work on the 10+2 directors of architecture. Why 10+2? Read the article, read the book, and you will see why. And more one-shot actions, such as a seminar organized for 40th anniversary for the 1977 Act, and another symposium that was held a couple of weeks after the death of Max Derriam, the first director of architecture. In September and January 2015, we all took contact with Anne-Marie Châtelet, professor in Strasbourg, and she asked us whether we would be interested by collaboration financing of an action she wanted to take on the history of architecture of the 19th century. She had 2 major academics around her, Marine Jomet in Paris, and from Brest to Strasbourg, you see, you have 2 major academics, and this was quite a strong line for France, east-west, so we could not say, no, it was not the Vitruvius man, but still, with Charclin in Lille, north of France, Marco in Lyon, in the center, some others in Marseille. We have somebody Vitruvius man into the French territories, like an octopus with arms here and there. Anyway, nobody's perfect. Even when you have Francisco Dalco with you. Anyway, all this has been taught during the day, but we're still people who love writing. And it might be good to have something written. We don't know what type of work we would get into. And once we have thought about collections of monographies on the schools of architecture, out in the regions, or Paris region, or the post-colonial period, but I mean nothing mature had been prepared. And we already had some books from Strasbourg and Nantes. We then decided or went towards an encyclopedia. By the way, I should be telling you that there were very few of us at the Committee of History. And then, when we came back with all our friends, Marie-Yvonne de Saint-Bulgent said, we're not a one-stop shop. We're not here to just disseminate money and investment. Okay, you're not just a one-stop shop, so much the better. But we became the slaves of that project. One meeting a month, then two, etc. I guess we worked 3 days a month for 8 years, which goes against the labor rules, I should say. Anyway, we had an encyclopedia, and the Comité d'Histoire has a library with a lot of encyclopedia. Of course, Le Corbusier Encyclopedia from Jacqueline Caen for this century, but also you had the Malraux Encyclopedia, the Brittany Encyclopedia, Le Quidic, and from many others. The Commun, there was another encyclopedia of cultural history. You know, when you have such a vast topic to tackle, it's very difficult to be concrete. So we decided on 1 volume, number of pages, number of notes, and we said we would have one intellectual object that would have something like 400, 500 titles, 600, 700 pages, 24 million signs, and 100 participants to it. So we all started working rather slowly. We've drafted notes, statistics, 15,000 signs, 20,000 signs, and we asked our scientific committee, we didn't often meet, but still, to participate by phone or mail to our work. And I'm giving you the name. Albergo, New York, comme you all know, Philippe Boudon, still with us, David Cohen from New York, Montreal, Collège de France, Jean-Pierre Hepron. Honorary Professor of the ENSA, and Jean-Michel Legnaud, the École des Chartes, Jacques Lucan, Luc Noppen from Quebec, Pascal Horry, French Academy, Jean-Pierre Penaud, late François Perret died last year, Antoine Pro, Professor Emeritus, History and Policy of Education, and Rebecca Rogers, Education and Women. Right. We had a number of problems in front of us, defining the inputs, clusters of inputs. We had brainstorming session where we, just pulled out all the words. We just connected them in clusters, including the shadow notes in encyclopedias refer to another explanation. It's very complex work, and yet, to start, we got opinions from the scientific committee.
Several questions were put. How do we have an objective encyclopedia with the historical text when the history of the École des Beaux-Arts is the history of decadence? Whatever judgment we might have over the school, it's in a way the story of a decadence compared to the other movements in the world. So that's the second question. The third question, it's another question which was a problem, which was the nominal entrances. For reasons difficult to explain, we gave up nominal entrances because there are no entrances of Le Corbusier or whatever. And I regret it because I think Le Corbusier would have been very important. We tried to integrate him because of the myth of the opposition, the myth on the two sides of the opposition, Beaux-Arts and Le Corbusier. That is something constructive, the major breaks between before and after the war. And there was no Atelier Arrête, Le Trémoline. So those are the few questions that were discussed, and we reached some agreements amongst us. And then there was the question of finding a publisher. And it was quite difficult because, of course, we didn't have any money at all. No funds. We had to provide the funds because this kind of cost 75,000 euros or 100,000 euros. And so we need to have a flexible contract with the publisher so we might not engage ourselves too definitively. We had contacts with a lot of publishers right from the summer of 2017 with Cédric Michon from the Presse Universitaire de Rennes and Max Bedarriga, Christophe Chabat, his successor, Pierre Gaudin for Créafis, and who else? Lena Kogato for the Métis Press that are extremely important in the French publishing for the university architectural books, Florence Locus and Les Auditions Lodi du Patrimoine. So we started preparing the first explanatory booklets. We received a lot of estimates, and we chose the two cheapest, not because they were less expensive, but because they were most credible, one of the Villette and Customus. And the meeting with the manager of Customus was decisive because it was a man who was very methodical. He gave us attention notes, very articulate, very fine, allowing a good dialogue, and we turned towards that publisher. And in his bag, he brought a graphic designer, Le Carnec. Le Carnec is one of the three major graphists trained in the Polish schools of the 60s with Roman Hichelik, with the Arpus group. Urkanek. These are the three major figures of French graphism of the 60s, trained in that beautiful school, which was the Polish school. So he first gave us a cover with a capital A. I remember that the first work I had done was at the Direction de l'Architecture, an anthology, Dornano's time, so that's a long time back, in 76 or 77. And here it was a question of preparing a catalog of all the books that had been published in France. And then there were a lot of books, and there was another A 40 or 50 years ago. I didn't personally like it. You know, an architecture book with a big capital A, there are many. So I went to see him. He's quite a grumpy person, 80 years old, and he doesn't need any lessons. And he gave us this cover, which is a kind of poster, something that was quite violent, and we were attracted by it because we saw this abstraction. These aren't solid Platonicians, but it gives the image of architecture, which is powerful and violent, with the pavements of the 68. So it was an open book. And before giving the floor to Amandine, what do? We gradually, with a large number of researchers and authors, we placed orders. And there was a huge amount of work. I had run away. I went to Brittany 2 years ago because of the lockdown. But each evening, the wave after my bout would bring me back to the coast. And each evening, I would find new work to do. And this is very interesting and very painful because these were the years of distancing and meeting on computers, to which we've got used to, unfortunately. So we were caught over by all this. And then we began rereading the explanatory booklets. They really suffered from our multiple readings. There were a lot of readers, the 7 people I talked to you about, and some that I have to mention: Gilles Bienvenu from Nantes, Éric Langereau, Richard Klein, Sharon Abadi, and Maxime de Commer, who published a book, and I think it's going to be published on the history of teaching. So these explanatory booklets were read, reread. There was a lot of come and go. And for those that are completed, it's not fully completed. We're going to go to the mock-up. We have a temporary mock-up for one of the chapters, and we've received all the explanatory booklets for that. Now, the funding, very quickly. We do not know how much the book will cost exactly, but we will manage to fund it. The funding will come from various bodies: the History Committee of the Ministry of Culture, la Direction des Patrimoines et de l'Architecture, l'Académie des Beaux-Arts, 2 regional directors of cultural affairs, the Association of the Mayors of the large French cities. So you see, we went to get it from far away. Many architectural schools, not all. I hope that all will contribute over the long term. The Booklets Academy that gave us a subsidy. It's very nice. And we received a refusal from the École des Beaux-Arts, which shows that this school doesn't care about architecture anymore. 3 or 4 years ago, we had received a subsidy for a book that we were planning to publish, a non-French edition of the great German book, the thesis of Jorn on the history of the Beaux-Arts school. So there's a change in the Beaux-Arts, and we're not welcome there anymore, we architects or historians. So I'm going to give the floor to Amandine, who was going to talk about all this more precisely. Thank you very much. So I have to present, to end this day, the work that we've been carrying out for the past 3 years for this book. And we've been working on this book, and we're trying to build a method to do so. The project is complex. How can we write the story of the teaching of architecture in France in the 20th century with all the dimensions, pedagogical, professional, territorial, political, that embraces all the institutions that have delivered it in a way or another? Now, to begin, this is a thematic rationale, as recalled earlier on, that guided our research. We had to set up themes covering the topics I'm going to mention, and the order does not translate any hierarchy. The first concerns the establishments. Freelance has a major place in this list of establishments, but we wanted to have the panel of all those where the teaching of architecture had been dispensed in the 20th century. Go back to the history, the content of the teaching given, the number of professionals trained, and as much as possible mention the outlets that were given to the graduates. The second on teaching and pedagogy. So we had to go back on the methods of teaching architecture and their evolutions by looking at the invariants, the evolutions, the breaks, the tools, conceptual and material, publications, and the forms of teaching that were determined and stable before 1968, and then there were multiple of these, many of these afterwards. Then we wanted to evoke development in the schools, the links with teaching, with university research on the other hand, and we wanted to try to have a laboratory mapping going back to the research topics that were developed, the post-diploma trainings, and the professional channels. The fourth topic concerns the places where architecture is taught. We were thinking about the spatial areas, which is important in teaching, the École des Beaux-Arts, of course, and the schools that were built for this. And the next topic are on the teaching figures and the students. We have to look at the demography, the social origins, the nationalities, and the genders. We wanted to go back on the links between the school faculties and the secondary school, the groupment in associations and trade unions. The practices of students was also observed in its conditions, the jargon, the folklore. And for a long time, this was mixed with the history of the teaching of architecture. And the before last point, the one on the relations and international exchanges, we wanted to evoke the influence of the Beaux-Arts teaching abroad and the pedagogies coming from elsewhere. The emphasis on teaching and the development of these exchanges. And the last topic is related to the profession, integrating the role and the impact it had throughout time on teaching, but also the relations, either direct or indirect, between the professional world and teaching world. The outlets and the types of liberal or salary jobs or professional groups. These entry points allowed us to draw throughout the months and years the structure of the encyclopedia with the mapping so that you can look at all the themes broached in the 20th century. To favor continuity and to look at the resurgences in the 20th century, we decided to treat all the explanatory booklets of the encyclopedia over this vast period that is 1903 to 2005. And we are mobilizing what is necessary to understand this history in former times. We're developing this when we're going up to the 21st century. The story of the establishments with their current names, with the École nationale supérieure d'architecture. This means regional architecture schools, but also establishments that emerge in the 18th and 19th century. As for the breaking points that the 68 events led to, things were less systematic, except when there were new orientations like research that involves pedagogical changes. We made the choice to avoid explanatory booklets and biographies. Everything's mentioned in the booklets. There'll be an augmented index at the end of the book. Now that we've established these principles, we had to limit the gauge of the explanatory booklets. There was a hierarchized vision of all the diverse subjects. We went from the article to the essay, from 1,500 to 20,000 characters, according to the chronological amplitude of the phenomenon described and classified according to the alphabetical order. As in any encyclopedia and cultural dictionaries, cross-sectorial reading is encouraged. Global notices refer to more detailed explanatory notes. The list of explanatory notes changed and got stabilized. The encyclopedia has 220 explanatory booklets, and there are some phantom ones, so that means that there was no specific development, but it guides the reader through a reference system. They are drafted without any call for notes, and there is a corpus of text with a small insert with a few bibliographical references referring to the topic concerned and a few references. These aren't systematic, but they meet a geographical rationale. For example, the reader, having consulted the ENSA booklet of Nancy, they will have information on Nancy, the ENSA building, in its chronological tranche. And so there were 110 contributors for these notices, specialists of all the topics, whether they're researchers or young doctorates. You have a rich number of participants, and the foreign researchers were mobilized for their skills in certain topics. And this book, called L'Architecture and its School, an encyclopedia in the teaching of architecture in the 20th century, is a vast collective effort and will give us state of knowledge on the history of the teaching of architecture in the 20th century. So, of course, there's a big section on the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and it will reveal a large number of establishments that are often unknown. For example, l'École département de l'architecture de Volvic, l'École des hautes études de Tongjing also. It will also mention projects that were sometimes left on paper, like the schools, the projects drawn on Compiègne, Tours, or Dijon. It will be the opportunity to draw a history of all the tools, the drawings of architecture from graphos to the IT tool, or to mention the presence and the influence of certain groups and networks in teaching, whether they're connected to political trends or even religious trends. made up of 4,000 characters, 760 pages. The book would have a general introduction explaining the chronological limits of this history and the editorial choices that we've made, 320 notices as such. Here I'm showing you the mock-up that was made for letter I. So these notices illustrated by rich iconography, 750 pictures, a chronology in the annex with the main points of the history of teaching in the 20th century, a bibliography, which is a general one, and an index of names, as mentioned earlier on. The book will be made up of a portfolio of images with the works of students, and there will be 1,500 copies for a sales price of 49 euros. And there'll be a digital version that will be made accessible. So at the time when the Ministry of Culture is preparing a national strategy for architecture so as to strengthen the scientific, professional, and territorial routings of these schools, this book, which is historical, wants to offer the keys to appreciate this situation by precising the origin of the knowledge. It is meant for the students in architecture and for the teachers. It's meant for amateurs and professionals, and it's to improve the culture of architects. It should be ready by next fall, in the autumn of 2022. But in the meantime, we're continuing our work, and we want to warmly thank those who are contributing to this project. Thank you very much.
Voilà, nous avons donc confié la conclusion à celle qui...
So we're going to ask Marie-Vonne de Saint-Pugène to conclude. It's thanks to her that this project exists. So thank you for welcoming me. So I've understood that François Chalin has become my slave. It's made me completely handicapped. You see, the damage is huge. So therefore, in a strange position, I have to close this symposium, because I only took part in it because of a constant concern. This is one of the topics we most talked about in the History Committee in the last 6 years. And this concerned us, and it made us really enthusiastic. And I have the great honor of taking part in the launching here. And it's my pleasure to be here for the closing. For a project which will have taken 6 years, or more than 6 years, if we end in the autumn of 2022 with the encyclopedia, that will make 7 years. And this is the longest project in which the History Committee has committed, that I had the great honor of presiding after its founder, Augustin Gérard. I'd like to pay tribute to him each time I have the opportunity to talk about him. Without Augustin, all that we're doing here would have no meaning, wouldn't have been possible. So therefore, a commitment that was material, financial, and even it was a question of accommodation sometimes in hotels, but intellectual too. Scholar, you've heard the impressive list of people who've contributed to this project. A significant number of them are members of the History Committee, the Comité d'Histoire. And I would like to particularly thank Geneviève Gentil, who couldn't be here, as François Chalin said, Arlette Auduc, who was the person who spoke to me most about this project in the past 6 years. And she talked about the oral archives here, and she was my permanent interface. And I know that she was devoted to this project. And the others were mentioned this morning and this afternoon, so I'm not going to go back to this. I'd like to also thank all these people.
The intellectual interest of such a committee It's sad that I thank François for having recalled the various missions he and others went through. Between what Augustin and Geneviève have wanted, which was build and disseminate the historical policy of cultural architecture and cultural institutions. We report to the Ministry of Cultures, therefore. I keep recalling and reminding this fact. Public policy of the Ministry of Culture. Now the project which gathered us has enabled us to go further ahead on public policies, and especially architecture and education on architecture, teaching architecture. In fact, we have worked much more on architecture than on educating to architecture. It is the major work for the future, which we had not done. We only had talked about the product of that teaching. Architecture as a policy is maybe less looked into than others, for reasons such as the fact that it is a skill that the Ministry of Culture had, then lost, then gained back. So the problem is that of a blank. What do we do of the period when we were not in charge of this policy, but we don't want to ignore what happens? So this is one of the reasons why we worked on the topic. And some of the researchers still challenge our legitimacy on the topic. Hence, a field of research that is highly fragmented and in which you have a lot of goodwill or individual interests, because we're not the only ones to discuss. At the Ministry of Equipment, there is a committee on history, in which we don't overlap, but some people say, oh yes, there's another committee that discusses the same topic as we do, and you see that sometimes we have been difficulty in keeping quiet or calm about this type of topic. So thank you again to the team who very early, very much upstream, mentioned the topic. Eric Gross, the very first, talked about the project to me. I had met him before. And then came a network of friends and accomplices to which we were associated, and as François Chalin. We arrived rather late in this type of project to which we have contributed, or are contributing. As François Chalin recalled, the very first work was Eric Langeron's doctorate thesis, which we published, and then a volume of oral archives, which in fact he set up. So he's a director +2 from the civil servant ranking, +2. It's a difficult question of transfers of our structures and back into the Ministry of Culture. Still a topic of discussion between us and our friends from the Ministry of Equipment. I don't want to go back to the original 1977 essay, which I very much was interested in, because along this topic I saw the conflicts when architecture went back to culture back in 1975. So the quarrel between this heritage and culture, and the conflict was pulled down. Everyone was discussing architecture without challenging or questioning the patrimoine, the assets, historical assets. I had to manage the transfer, so I did not follow all the problems of lesser conflicts behind. But anyway, this fight was never mentioned, so I guess it's behind us, and I want to congratulate you all. One of the reasons for such a transfer was to reconcile the two sides of architecture. And in fact, none of the two sides was the winner for being discriminated against the other. Public policy of architecture means that right from the beginning we should have taken a central view. But the Committee of History is one where we have a lot of ideas, but we must have the means to implement them, the resources. We do not have the team to work, and as long as we don't have the team, it remains nothing but a project. Nothing happens. So when the project came on the table, we decided to buy into the project immediately because it was a central decision by the committee. No schools, no teachers originally, so no creation, nothing to create. But then right from the beginning, there was a specific interest. And the fact that I was asked by the schools of architecture themselves to start this project, by the teachers themselves, and something not devised from Paris was greatly interesting to me, because I found, and I still find that one of the traps in which our Committee of History might have fallen would have been that it was much too Paris-oriented, and as one wanted to radiate and disseminate history all over the French region. So I found it was interesting to have this project circulating over the whole regions due to a mobilization of the schools in the region. And we saw this morning how, when you explain what happened out in your Vieri school, this is interesting. Now, some of the schools stayed out of the process, but still. Another characteristic of the project was very interesting. The fact that the program was spanning over the long time horizon. May 1968, an extension, Middle Ages before, and the modernity afterwards. Sometimes the history of architecture and the way it was taught was right in the center. The history was not that of those who initiated the topics, because the very first attempt was under Malraux and Gustin Girac, and we started in 1959. And it is under my presidency that the committee decided not to stick to 1959, but go back upwards in history. Public history and culture may span over several centuries. And in terms of architecture, yes, there had been a Direction de l'Architecture, like we had major directorates at the origin of the Ministry of Culture. So it would be meaningless to take the Malraux period only under study. So again, this was another concern for long-term historical review. Well, even though it's relatively recent history, then you worked in a continuous manner, continuity, unquaveringly, and I noted with great interest that even if your topic is 20th century, you did really go back in time when history had to be clarified for the object of your presentations. So you had to show transmission, breakthrough, ruptures, the remnants of culture. Of course, violence ups and downs sometimes, some in the 19th century. Viollet-le-Duc, was a moment, an important moment, 1860, but 19th century, 1863 especially, even though it remained as a conflict or a quarrel between the top classes. So the schools, those who had no project, joined in. Very interesting. We worked out in the regions systematically, and showing what they had in common. Many of the schools took their origin in the 19th century, for instance. One point of common, before the spectacular decentralization policy, a slight cultural decentralization, an interesting parallel between the origin of the schools of architecture out in the regions and the origin of the conservatoire in the same places, in the local communities, with the joint initiative of the elites and the sectors, with a decision from the states. And the state was the Third Republic at that time, to finance, together with the local communities, to finance these schools. So the same movement and simultaneous political decision. It's interesting because you see the story of the cultural policy, which is not a story, just narrative is told. I mean, saying the state does everything and then we cascade down and we try and set up a program. No, not at all. You had a central policy from Paris, from the French Revolution, under the previous regime, and then you have a municipal policy that developed in the 1830s, 1840s. And both policies are carried out in parallel. And at a given time, in the 19th century, they just kept together, co-financing, and the state classifies, like a label, financement or financing some work. And the decisions are taken at the French Parliament. It's not a decision from the administration, no, from the Parliament who discusses. It's interesting to see in the publications early in the 20th century, an exhaustive explanations of cultural policy, report, essays, the Council of State, also Conseil d'État, to a whole list of schools of architecture, art, architecture, that the state decided to support financially due to their high quality standards of education. And making sure that we have the right professors and the right curriculum. Now, for our modern time, the network of schools had not been well identified or not well known, which brings us to this co-fabrication of this program, opening up the number of correspondents, the academic network, universities. You know, the other orientation of the committee is doing nothing without the cooperation of universities. So we work with that university environment. Now, since the most recent reform, there are schools preparing to PhD for architecture. So the academics has now joined the schools of architecture in this curriculum. As to the teaching of architecture, this is one of the sector which opens up onto other sectors. We see a specialization from all the other networks. We have a number of other musicology. But I mean, especially apart from music is thought as an addition to the curriculum. And this is the modern way of adding to the curriculum, which brings out onto global questions much more than the cultural policy type of projects. Quality of life, housing, constructions, the building sector, and sustainable development, which we too often hear about.
So that is a theme that you have in common with cultural heritage, which is a champion of sustainable development, but not without reason, because the topic is to preserve for as long as possible. So it's a very vast program to say that the quality of quality should irrigate all the public interventions. But that was also the position of, during the time of the Enlightenment in the 18th century and of the encyclopedia as such. So it's going back to the French academic sources, the thought on art. And the transversal calls for a project have put forward some large thematic research, and this raised many responses. This morning, I saw that this work was very fruitful. I knew about some aspects, but I was really surprised and enchanted by the diversity and the quantity and the quality of the productions to which you've arrived in all the areas where you intervened. And the other dimension of this program are the relations with the profession. We know that they are militants. There are also divisions, and there's a lot of agitation. And architects are entrepreneurs, and they like order. So you have the radical pedagogies. I've gone to architectural offices. They have economic concerns, etc. And it isn't sure, as the ministers believe, that they are fundamentally anarchists. And this can be discussed, actually, this trend to anarchy of architects. Once they have their office, this anarchy becomes more complicated to combine with their other responsibilities. And this relationship with the profession, the Ministry of Culture, has always had a few difficulties because it's a profession that is very strongly structured intellectually. And it doesn't make the task easier for its guardianship. And sometimes it's a bit delicate. And so therefore, we have a lot of common ideas. We agree on the major principles, but sometimes there are problems with the details. And in general, the organization of the Ministry of Culture has trouble taking into account the different professions and jobs. It's not just a question of in architecture that we have this question. It's not just in architecture that we have this question. The Ministry of Culture is the Ministry of Artists. And since the 19th century, you don't have artists just like that. I mean, it's a real profession. It's a real métier. And the professional relations, what the ministry can do for these professions as such, that is always difficult and it's not natural at the ministry. So we were also interested, as the History Committee, to have this opening on the question on professions. And the other field, which is very important in this work, are the relations with the local communities. Another topic which is older, and the History Committee has really worked on it, this relations with the territories. And the other dimension, and we've had some interesting looks into that, very varied this afternoon, is the international dimension. I'd like to particularly thank the three speakers who spoke this afternoon about this question regarding the architect and his role in the transmission, in the analysis of his art and the teachings. We see the diversity of cultures. I was struck in the last presentation, the absence of France in this presentation, except in the last one where he spoke about France. So the work you are going to complete next year is not worthless because we will put France back into this international reflection, which seems to circumvent it. It is beating around the bush. It's not penetrating it. Maybe it's our fault, but I think that your work is not a small task considering what we heard this afternoon. It is indispensable to give our tradition its rightful place. But I think that this international opening can be the subject of a deepening, and it'll be easier when you will receive the results of your research that you will spread around and present to other countries. So for us, the result of this work is extremely positive. I'd just like to remind you that there was a first phase of production of work tools accessible to all, the guide of sources, the oral archives, which are very important, the history of the schools and the preservation of our archives, which is a work underway, because we've seen that the program was far from being completed. However, I think that there was momentum given, and each institution should think about its history, just so as to maintain the flame. This morning, we underlined that the new architects, the new students, were less attached to their schools than the previous generations, maybe because these schools are not that well identified in the history for them, and we have to attach them to the history of their school to recreate this feeling of belonging, which is very important for the future. Seminars that succeeded and that we've published in the research book, and this produced a mass of knowledge, and this snowballed. Each seminar produces new ideas, and I think that this is going to continue, and that is what we firmly wish. And the main point is the encyclopedia, and François Chalin and Amandine Jenner talked about it. Its publication will be in the fall of 2022. We can wait for a few more months, I'd like to reassure you. If I can judge from the long saga of the encyclopedic dictionary, we have to be patient. You have to be patient. But you have to try to advance and respect the lead times, but we've been used by your colleagues to be patient and to wait for the publishing of such books. And in any case, I am moved to see that this project, which was born from the few meetings at our Comité d'Histoire, hey, why don't we come up with an encyclopedia, you know? And we were helped by terrestrial food, and so to the general stupor, it is coming true. It was highly ideological, and you have done it. I'd like to pull my hat off to you. Arlette talked about it the first time. I found that was a wonderful idea, but I was wondering how they would manage to do it all the same. And I see that it's almost completed, and sorry, François, but I didn't tell you at the beginning that you should prepare an encyclopedia. I didn't do that. So I'm just partially responsible for this huge burden you've put on your backs. But you seem to have withstood this burden. You seem to be in top form. So, To end, I think that it is almost completed. My colleagues from the Direction des Patrimoines Services de l'Architecture, they weren't patient enough at some points of time. We have to say it is completed, otherwise they will have a nervous breakdown and they will say, for God's sake, how on earth are they still working on this? But what you've opened is a project, and for many of our projects, it must be pursued. Maybe not in this form, maybe not with this type of institutionalization, but I think that you have managed to reopen a research project, a publication project that I'd like to pay tribute to beforehand, and it's going to be very fruitful. So like many of our works, it's not an end, it's just a beginning. It's a beginning which is quite legitimate because now you have the doctorate school and you can keep doing research. And other tracks have appeared during the past 6 years, and so therefore you can not only continue on the history of schools and extend the reflection on teaching and open new paths that your current research will have revealed to you. And just before thanking you once again and thanking the Cité de l'Architecture et du Patrimoine, which is dear to my heart, as Marie-Hélène Comtal knows, I'm always happy to come back because this is a project that has reached completion after many hazards and ups and downs, and I'm happy to have heard the president and the spokeswoman, Marie-Hélène, to say that this is the house of architects, this is what we wanted, and the reconciliation of the two sections of architecture. So therefore, we'll always be here, and I'd like to remind those who are still in schools right now that we feel that there aren't enough proposals for the thesis prize jury that has been transferred to us in a totally illegitimate way. I chair it to award the prizes, 3 prizes for the publication of a thesis, and we have very few architecture theses, not enough considering the state of research, as we know. So if you can talk about this in your network, the existence of this prize, this award, we have architecture theses, but not enough. And we cannot convey this message. And last year, among the 3 laureates, there was one on l'IFA, the construction of the IFA architects, which was crowned without any difficulties, and it demonstrates that the architectural thesis can compete compared to law, economy, sociology, the history of art thesis. And we have 3 prizes, awards, and some of the best prizes allowing the publication of these theses. So I'd like to invite you to convey this message so that we do not observe an underrepresentation of architectural theses among the theses submitted to us. Thank you and good luck for the future.